Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining our special program commemorating Stewart Udall's centennial. My name is Robert Varady, and I'm a research professor at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy at the University of Arizona. The Udall Center is a co-host and lead organizer of this event, which will highlight some of Stewart Udall's efforts in environmental diplomacy in the US, in Indian country, and overseas. The University of Arizona honors the responsibility of being both a land-grant institution and a Hispanic serving institution. Thus, we'd like to begin today's event by first recognizing the indigenous lands on which we're privileged to teach and learn, those of the Tohono O'odham Nation and the Pascua Yaqui tribe. Now it's my great privilege to introduce the president of the University of Arizona, Dr. Robert Robbins.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Stewart L. Udall's Environmental Diplomacy Legacy Centennial Birthday Celebration. Stewart Udall had an incredible impact on natural resources and environmental governance and policy here in Arizona, the Southwest, and internationally. And I am glad to see his legacy as a visionary and an environmental diplomat honored. I'm very proud of the expanding collaboration between the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy here at the University of Arizona and the Udall Foundation on environmental policy, Native Nations governance, and the Udall Special Collection at the University of Arizona Library. The University of Arizona is committed to science diplomacy, and this event is an excellent example of how the center and the foundation are working together to create a sustainable global future. Thank you for being here. I hope you have a wonderful conversation.
Now I'd like to introduce our next welcomer and co-host, Professor Sean Sutton, the Dean of the University Libraries at the University of Arizona. Professor Sutton.
Good afternoon. I'm Sean Sutton, Dean of University Libraries and Catherine B. Willock Endowed Chair at the University of Arizona Libraries. We are delighted to be a part of today's event since the archival collections of the Udall family, including the papers of Stewart Udall, are a keystone of our Special Collections Department. The Stewart Udall papers include a variety of documents, letters, speeches, photographs, recordings, and other materials that provide a firsthand perspective on Stewart's entire career, including his time in Congress and as Secretary of the Interior in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Although many of these materials date from 60 to 70 years ago, the issues that they illuminate, environmental protection, clean water and air, wilderness preservation, and support for Native American communities are just as vital in today's society as they were during the last century. In supporting research and engagement in these areas, the UA Library Special Collections Department is proud to have a long-standing partnership with the Udall Foundation, including hosting graduate assistantships that provide UA students with hands-on experiences in an archival research setting that prepares them for success in a variety of professional fields. We also facilitate the use of the Udall papers by scholars from around the world, and today's program will reflect some of the insights gained from studying these materials. On behalf of the University of Arizona Libraries, thank you to everyone who has made today's event possible to honor the legacy of Stewart Udall and his continuing impact on our country and on our world.
Thank you, Sean. Now it's a tremendous pleasure for me to introduce Eric Eberhardt, a longtime trustee and since 2011, almost 10 years, chair of the Board of Trustees of the Federal Morris K. Udall and Stewart L. Udall Foundation. The Udall Foundation, with which the Udall Center has a permanent relationship, is our third partner in organizing and hosting this commemoration. Eric?
Thank you, Bob. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees and staff of the Morris K. Udall and the Stewart L. Udall Foundation. I want to welcome all of you who are here with us today. I can see we have well over 100 participants. We just hit 120 as a matter of fact, and a fair number of staff folks with us. Very good turnout, and we really appreciate all of you being with us today. I want to thank the University of Arizona, President Robbins and Dean Sutton, the Arizona Library Special Collections, my dear friend and colleague Ann Udall, Chris Scott, Bob himself, and David Brown, Molly Bryson, and Beth Monroe for being with us today and for their efforts over many months to bring this program together and to get all of us together today. A special thank you to Senator Udall and our keynote presenters, Scott Einberger and Judge Humetewa, as well as our moderator, Andrea Gerlach, and our panelists, Carlotta Chief, Jennifer Pitt, and Kartikeya Singh, for their willingness to join us and to provide substance and perspective to this celebration of Stewart Udall's 100th birthday and his lasting legacy. I want to offer just one brief observation. I took some time over the last couple of months to go back and reread Stewart's The Quiet Crisis, which, as I think many of you know, was first published in 1963 when he was the Secretary of Interior, and then The Quiet Crisis and the Next Generation, which was published 25 years later in 1988. And my observation is this, out of rereading those: I am sure that if Stewart was here today, he would be alarmed about climate change and the polarization and division in our politics and our society. I am also very sure, though, that he would be very proud of and inspired by the work that is going on at the university, the Udall Center, the foundation, and that he would be brimming over with excitement and anticipation, hope and confidence about the energy and vision of the rising generations in this country and the changes they herald in the years ahead for the country and for all of us. I hope we can capture some of that energy and vision today. I'm honored to now introduce the Vice Chair of the Foundation's Board of Trustees, Ann Udall, and grateful that she is able to be here today to introduce Senator Udall and for all that she has done in the last 28 years to help make the center and the foundation what they are. I'm very grateful for her leadership and friendship and our partnership over the 20 years I have served on the board with her. Ann?
Hi, everybody. As Eric said, I am Ann Udall, Vice Chair of the Udall Foundation, and I cannot tell you how much fun it is and what a pleasure it is to be able to introduce my cousin, Senator Tom Udall. Tom's family, known as the Stewdalls in our extended group, and my family, known as the Modalls, grew up together in Tucson and DC. Over the years, Tom has been like a brother to all of the Modalls, serving with Mark in the House and the Senate, supporting me and the rest of the Udall Foundation in our work, being an amazing uncle to all my nieces and nephews, a yearly hiking companion with my niece and nephews, a constant, steady presence at times of celebration and grief in our large extended family. He is also a wonderful husband to his amazing wife, Jill, and a stepdad to his daughter, Amanda. Tom will finish his second term in the US Senate in a little over 60 days. I'm not sure he's on a countdown, but 60 days. Prior to being a US Senator, he served in the House of Representatives for 4 terms, was the Attorney General for New Mexico for 10 years. He's been a leader throughout, and he's been most known for his work in Native American affairs, environmental issues, military and security concerns, and campaign finance reform. Although Tom is mostly associated with the work I just mentioned, I think of his work on the amending and reauthorization of the Toxic Substances Control Act as a perfect snapshot into Tom's character and legislative acumen. This was a piece of legislation long overdue, and one that was desperately needed to reform and update the nation's safety system for thousands of chemicals and many products that we all use daily. Tom brought his signature tenacity and commitment to do the right thing for people and the planet in the face of initial deep opposition from both sides of the aisle. He demonstrated the traits that I most love about Tom. Do the right thing, be kind to people while you're doing the right thing, even when they aren't being kind back to you, and don't give up. The bill eventually passed by a vote of 403 to 12. Wouldn't we like those kinds of margins these days in the House, and a voice vote in the Senate. Tom's decision to not run for a third term is another example of who my cousin is. My dad used to say that the only cure for running for president was embalming fluid, and I sometimes think that applies to US senators as well. When Tom announced his decision to not seek a third term, he simply said, "The worst thing anyone in public office can do is believe the office belongs to them rather than the people they represent." In sum, Tom exemplifies the values of our family and the values of the foundation: civility, integrity, consensus. A number of years ago, when the foundation expanded to include his father's legacy as well, we were all able to be together in Tucson. And it was a joy for me. It was one of the last times I was ever able to see both Tom and his dad together, to see my amazing uncle and my amazing cousin together on that day, representing across generations the foundation's values, civility, integrity, and consensus, was a very special day. Thank you, cuz and brother. I think of Tom often as a brother, for being such a great friend to the foundation. Thank you for being a true public servant, for all you have done and for all you will do in the future to continue to make the planet a better place. Tom, all yours.
Oh, okay, terrific. Okay, well, Anne, just thank you so much for that. Just very, very special introduction. You know, I hate with an introduction like that to even speak. She's kind of he's put me so far up here, all I can do is come down. But I have to speak because this is about my dad, and I so appreciate all the wonderful people that are here. Eric, thank you for your incredible years of service. Both you and Ann have been amazing at keeping the Udall Foundation on the right track. Earlier, we heard from President Robbins and Shan Sutton. Thank you. And just all the Board of Trustees that are on, Udall family and friends. Thank you so much. And I want to welcome my fellow speakers, Scott Einberger and Judge Diane Humetewa. All the panelists, Udall family and friends, and everyone here today, welcome, welcome. It's an honor to gather with you this morning to celebrate what would have been Dad's 100th birth year. Even though we can't be together in person, gathering virtually means giving so many more of us the opportunity to be in one place and to think a little bit about my father and his legacy, and were there any lessons we could learn from him. As I've been reflecting on my dad's legacy this year, it's become clear to me just how much we can and must learn from his vision as we confront the existential crises facing the planet. During my father's first year as Secretary of Interior, the head of the Bureau of Reclamation flew him over southern Utah to show him the next big dam. My father was both a visionary and a doer. He took one look at the red rock spires below. He didn't see a dam. He saw the next national park. And he went back to Washington and helped create Canyonlands National Park. Back then, before the awakening of the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s, few people questioned the idea that economic development would always take precedence over protection of the environment. People like my father and many others focused the American people's attention to the consequences of economic development at all costs. Smog-filled cities, Lake Erie on fire, the bald eagle on the brink of extinction, the damming of rivers and destruction of special places. He did this because he believed that to accomplish his bold vision for conservation, he had to create a sense of shared stewardship for public lands. He saw the looming threats to our land, clean water, clean air, and warned the nation in his 1963 book, The Quiet Crisis. Here's a quote in what he wrote in that book. Each generation has its own rendezvous with the land. For despite our fee titles and claims of ownership, we are all brief tenants on this planet. By choice or by default, we will carve out a land legacy for our heirs. Along with scientists like his friend Rachel Carson, my dad called on the nation to act with urgency. And then, you know what? The strangest thing happened. The nation actually acted, and our bedrock conservation and environmental laws were created. My dad's legacy is one of strong advocacy, but also civility and seeking common ground with scientists, authors, activists, both political parties, and the grassroots. He understood you had to build a big, diverse coalition to get environmental action done. He knew that the only way to accomplish the broad protections of our natural environment was to work with colleagues across the aisle and with all political and personal backgrounds. He did not compromise on his fundamental values, but he also worked with people like private landowners to help them recognize that protecting public lands serve their interests as well. But Dad would not have wanted us to all gather here to just talk about how great he was. He would want us to focus on future generations. He would, just to tell you a little Udall story here, at one point, when he would hear people like me and others say, "You're standing on the shoulder of giants and you went to get things done," and he'd say, "Tom, get off my shoulders, get out there, do what you think's right and get it done." So he was all about action and doing. Toward the end of his life, he wrote a letter to his grandchildren in 2008. And he said, "This is the most important letter I will ever write. It concerns your future and the tomorrows of the innumerable human beings who share this vulnerable, fragile planet with you. It involves changes that must be made if environmental disasters are to be avoided. The response to this challenge will shape the future of the entire human race." That's the end of his quote there. Today, the climate and nature crises he warned about are not silent anymore. They have risen to a crescendo that we cannot ignore. Yes, we have to fix the wrongs of the Trump administration, But doing that alone is like putting a Band-Aid on a mortal wound. We face the dual crises of climate change and the destruction of nature. Here are the facts. 1 million species are threatened by extinction. We lose a football field's worth of nature every 30 seconds. Climate change is already having devastating effects, and each of us see it all around us. So we need to follow my dad's example with the same energy he summoned more than 50 years ago and write a new playbook. First, we must save nature. We must protect 30% of our lands and waters by 2030 to save the natural world as we know it. That's why I've introduced the 30 by 30 resolution to save nature in the Senate. And I'm excited that the Biden-Harris administration is committed to this goal. Second, we must confront climate change with everything we have. We must transition quickly to a carbon-free economy. And we should make our public lands pollution-free. A good goal to have there is carbon-neutral public lands. Fossil fuel emissions from public lands account for almost 1/4 of our CO2 emissions. Instead of being a source of pollution, public land should be part of the solution. And third, environmental justice must be our North Star. Low-income communities and communities of color bear the legacy of toxic pollution. Native American lands have been desecrated as we transition to a clean energy economy. Principles of equity and inclusion must guide our work, and no one can be left behind. And so I appreciate so much the beginning where you talked about Indigenous peoples and the tradition. You know, the Udall name was a dirty word in Alaska for a while because he forced the young state to treat the Alaska Native land claims more fairly. He recruited African Americans like my friend Bob Stanton into the National Park Service as a young man. And Bob did almost every job in the Park Service, and he eventually became the director. He helped desegregate the Washington football team. The American public has changed a lot since the 60s and 70s. So any successful environmental movement today needs to reflect that diversity. Native Americans and tribes have to be a big part of any land and conservation discussion. Inclusion is not just a word or a box you can check. It is a fully committed process. Leaders have to be sincere, take the time and listen. I know that the Udall Foundation is committed to that ideal. There is no doubt that the challenges before us are big. They will require bold action, but I know we can do it and do it together. Because the only choice we have is to be bold. I'm upbeat today because there's a major grassroots movement building on these issues. The people are demanding action. And I'm truly inspired by the young activists who are leading a new generation of the environmental movement. They represent the great diversity of this country. It is with their leadership that we will achieve a more equitable future. My message to the young leaders of today is to stay engaged and speak out about the issues that matter to you, but also get outside and develop a love of the land. If we don't love the land itself, appreciate its fragile beauty, then we won't fight for it. Toward the end of his life, my father wrote a letter to his grandchildren, a letter he called the most important he'd ever written. I leave you with one final quote from my dad, again from his letter to his grandchildren. Go well, do well, my children, he said. Cherish sunsets, wild creatures, and wild places. Have a love affair with the wonder and beauty of the earth. My father taught me that you have to do the hard work and lay the groundwork in order to protect the natural world for future generations. And that is why the work of the Udall Foundation is so important. And that's really what the Udall Foundation is all about. Right now, the wonder and beauty of the earth are under threat. It's up to all of us to work together to save this planet, to save humanity itself. Thank you so much. Wonderful to be with you today. And I'm looking forward to all of the speakers behind me. Cheers. Have a good day.
Thank you so much, Senator Udall, for those very special and personal words. Now we come to the heart of today's program, as Senator Udall just said, the keynote presentations. The first is by Scott Einberger, Stewart Udall's most recent biographer. Mr. Einberger is an independent environmental historian, author, and parks and public lands enthusiast. He's the author of the 2018 book, with, as you see on the screen, With Distance in His Eyes, The Environmental Life and Legacy of Stewart Udall. Scott will discuss Stewart Udall's environmental diplomacy legacy. Scott, please go ahead.
Well, it's great to be a part of this virtual commemorative event. I'd like to thank the Udall Center and the Udall Foundation and the University of Arizona Library, specifically its Special Collections Department for hosting this program today. I'd also like to thank you, Robert Verity, David Brown, and Steve Hussman for inviting me to speak here. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank the panelists, as well as my fellow presenter, Diane. I'm particularly interested in hearing her discuss Stewart's work on behalf of this country's Indigenous people. And finally, in part because we just heard from him, I'd like to say thank you to US Senator Tom Udall for his government service. Though I'm back living in my native Northern California now, I lived in Washington, DC for the better part of the last decade, and I had the honor of visiting with Senator Udall in his downtown DC office a couple of years ago. The Udalls are a special family. Not only am I referring to the big names such as Tom and Mark and Stewart Udall and Morris, I'm also referring to the extended family in places like St. John's in Phoenix and Las Cruces. 2 years ago, I did a 2-week vacation and book tour across the Southwest promoting my Stewart Udall environmental biography. St. John's is a small rural community in northeastern Arizona, about 40 miles south of Interstate 40, and it's where Stewart was born and raised. When I got to the small library there to give my talk, there were about 25 people in the audience, and most of them had the last name of Udall. I had never known of these individuals prior to my talk, and I didn't know that they would actually be there, but I will say that they all took me under their wings after the presentation. They gave me a private tour of Stewart's hometown there in St. John's. Some distant cousins made me a delicious country-style breakfast where I had fresh peaches and cream for the first time. And they enabled me to stay the night at the private residence of Stewart Udall's niece and visit Stewart's sister, who lives right next door. So again, there are lots, it's a special family, and a lot of them have human kindness and decency. In beginning my discussion on Stewart Udall's legacy within the context of environmental diplomacy, I'd like to start with, of all things, a poem. Stewart traveled domestically quite a bit as Interior Secretary in the 60s, and strolling quietly and contemplatively on a beach in San Diego early one morning in 1968, Stewart's tranquility was interrupted by the noise of an overhead airplane. This is his Once by the Pacific, which was published in the Saturday Review. At sunrise near a city on a beach, I heard the wash of surf, the calls of birds, the chiming of church bells, a foghorn's far-off song, a dog's cry, and a boy's. Tender noise like this has soothed the waking mind since Homer. But sullen morning came and engines ripped the urban air, annulling all the subtle sounds. Must all the soft chords go, torn by a savage celerity to caress us only at dawn and dusk? Or must we curse the sonic time and brace our ears against the din? To me, this poem is a good segue into this presentation on Stewart Udall for two reasons. First, it shows his uniqueness as Interior Secretary. He was an arts connoisseur and even an amateur poet. He was a de facto US Secretary of Culture. He was a voracious reader, writer, and researcher for half a century. When I visited with Senator Udall 2 years ago, he told me that his father was an intellectual. He was a Mormon, albeit, quote, my own type of Mormon, he said. He was a civil rights crusader. And perhaps finally, he was Mr. Fitbit, if you will, for his time, an avid hiker and outdoorsman. But back to the Udall poem, his poem, other than introducing us to his uniqueness, I think the poem helps introduce us to this concept of environmental diplomacy, of his worldwide work beyond the shores of the United States. The poem is Once by the Pacific, and he was, well, looking west over the Pacific to foreign shores. He was actually crossed the Pacific on several occasions. On November 22nd, 1963, he was flying across the ocean when he learned of President Kennedy's assassination. The plane did a 180 degree turn and headed back towards the nation's capital. But aside from Japan, in the larger world, Stewart Udall, among other places, visited the USSR. You can skip ahead here, please, to the next slide. Visited the USSR, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan, Turkey, Iran, Greece, Tanzania, Venezuela, Chile, and a few other countries. Hopefully I have most, if not all of them, in there in green. He talked at international conferences on conservation. So getting into the meat of this presentation then, I'd like to first share with you some of the main events and overarching concepts and themes of Udall's international diplomacy in the 60s. And second and lastly, I'll discuss his diplomatic work in terms of combating global warming, climate change, particularly in his later life, specifically in the late 1980s at none other than Robert Redford's Sundance Institute. Okay, so Stewart Udall's travels around the globe as US Secretary of the Interior. In his speeches to international bodies, what did he promote and why? Next slide, please, Molly. Largely, he promoted what I call common ground conservation of the 1960s. That is, per Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, he promoted generally non-controversial conservation measures to the world, and particularly US allies. Certainly, at least some of this common ground conservation diplomacy was done to try and keep countries under US and not USSR influence. This was the height of the Cold War. Common ground conservation in the 60s largely consisted of three pillars: national parks, outdoor recreation, and reclamation. I have more or less a picture of each here. That's my son at our campsite from last March. Have to show off my son Grayson there. But to broadly define these three categories, national parks first. Tucson, where the University of Arizona is, of course, has the 2 units of Saguaro National Park just out your back door. And I am talking to you right now in Northern California, an hour west of my favorite place on earth, Lassen Volcanic National Park. National parks in general are places where landscapes, native plants, and wild animals are preserved in their natural state. However, at the same time, the parks provide outdoor experiences for the public, so hiking, camping, scenic driving, and so on. Reclamation, another pillar of Udall's conservation diplomacy in the 1960s. Reclamation is a slightly odder term, but it essentially means controlling natural waterways for the use by mankind. Think dams, reservoirs, associated infrastructure, hydroelectric power plants. According to one official, the 60s were the, quote, go-go years for the funding and construction of large federal dams by organizations such as the Bureau of Reclamation. Interrelated to reclamation and national parks is outdoor recreation. And in post-World War II US, population booms and booming economy coincided with increasing amounts of leisure time for many people. Healthy exercise in the great outdoors was seen as a perfect leisure time activity. On the parks, reclamation, and outdoor recreation front, and really on the entire domestic affairs front, some came to believe that the Eisenhower administration of 1950s America didn't do a ton. Ike's physical conservatism was definitely at play here, and there's certainly some benefits to that, I would argue. But by and large, Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon in his first term, these three presidents ushered in an era of major government expansion in domestic affairs, particularly what was often referred to at the time as quality of life or conservation measures. In this era of big government funding and creating a new park, a new playground or recreation center, a new dam was both good government and good politics. And there wasn't a lot of opposition to these things in 1960s America. So Presidents Kennedy and Johnson used Udall as a common ground conservation diplomat. They had him promote parks, reclamation, and recreation throughout the world in the 1960s. I'll provide a couple of brief examples of these three pillars. So next slide, please. Outdoor recreation. To promote healthy exercise in the great outdoors, to promote the notion that President Kennedy and company were young and fit, and personally for Udall to show off and improve himself a bit in the job. In the early 60s, he scaled Japan's Mount Fuji and Tanzania's Mount Kilimanjaro. She's shown right here on the summit. And on the summit, he was with a Life magazine editor, and he was quoted as saying it's the most, he was quoted as saying that he was elated by the stunning view of vast glaciers only miles from the equator. He also described the mountain as unlike any other in the world. The Life magazine writer in the article said that Udall was, quote, the most ambitiously vigorous member of the vigorous new frontier. So national parks, in part because of the advances made in air travel in the late 1950s and early 60s, the 1960s ushered in an era of unprecedented national park creation. Udall was at the forefront of that in the national park system here in the United States, but outward facing worldwide, he was a major cheerleader for national parks out off of our shores in other countries. Under his watch, the National Park Service's small but mighty Office of International Affairs got up and running, and with its work and overseas missions largely funded through USAID, the Agency for International Development, NPS diplomats helped create master plans for national parks in places as far-flung as Jordan, Greece, and Turkey in the 1960s. Udall also keynoted a world conference on parks in Seattle on July 4th, 1962. And I can assure you that that conference being held over Independence Day was not a coincidence. Conservation was seen and promoted as patriotic. He said in keynoting the conference, he said, natural treasures are in reality a heritage to all mankind. They transcend provincial boundaries. So we've touched briefly upon Udall's diplomatic legacy in terms of recreation and national parks, but what about reclamation? Bringing water to parched landscapes, bringing power to the unpowered. These were popular mantras. Politicians of the US West, whether they were red or blue, generally approved of the federal reclamation program because it brought lots of political bacon, if you will, back to them. With the technical know-how based in organizations such as the Bureau of Reclamation, promoting and exporting this know-how overseas was seen as good diplomacy. And so Udall and reclamation experts from his department visited several arid countries of the world, particularly in the Middle East. Udall's most remembered diplomatic trip actually involved reclamation as common ground. After visiting the USSR reclamation and hydroelectric facilities in places like Moscow, Volgograd, Saratov, and Irkutsk, he left his Interior Department personnel and traveled to the home of Nikita Khrushchev on the Black Sea. Indeed, it was not the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, or Kennedy's National Security Advisor that was the first cabinet member to visit the Soviet leader. It was the Interior Secretary. For a few hours, Khrushchev and Udall talked by the Soviet leader's swimming pool, had a swim in the Black Sea, and then ate lunch. Khrushchev was quick to show off his sliding glass doors to Udall, which were state of the art for the time. At points in the conversation between the two, Khrushchev was on offense, telling Udall that the US was growing, quote, old and impotent. But on the note of common ground conservation, a more positive chord was struck. Khrushchev said, "The power field is a good one for competition, and in this competition, no one loses. It's not a competition to accumulate armaments, it's a competition for stockpiling wealth." Udall responded to the Soviet leader, "I would agree with that, Mr. Chairman. The most important thing is what a country does with its resources, and our two countries are both richly endowed with resources." So Udall was a conservation diplomat in the 1960s. Fast forward a couple of decades, Stewart is well out of political office, but his conservation and environmental fire remains strong. And actually, it's much stronger. Once you are out of political office, it's easier and also much safer to speak your mind and speak your convictions. Udall was in the vanguard of global warming climate change activism beginning in the late 1980s. I think that bears repeating, the late 1980s. So that's 2 decades before An Inconvenient Truth, and over 2 decades before 2010, 2011, the time of the last major push in Congress for a bill to substantially tackle climate change. My environmental biography of Udall is called With Distance in His Eyes, and the premise of that, the book and the title, is really that he was looking into the future and trying to get the country to tackle these challenges before they overwhelmed us. And so being on the forefront from the 80s onward through the end of his life on climate change activism is one of many examples of this. But during my book research, Robert Redford and his secretaries turned down my request for an informal phone interview, but somehow the two of them met each other and became friends in the 70s or 80s. Redford was impressed with the Arizonan, stating once that Udall's face should be on a nickel. In August of 1989, at Redford's Sundance Resort in the Wasatch Mountains of Utah, Udall, Redford, and a host of scientists and politicians from both the USSR and the USA came together for a 3-day conference. You can go to the next slide. The meeting was dubbed the Greenhouse Glasnost. Quite literally, it involved experts from the two countries openly discussing the threat of global warming and also discussing ways to tackle the problem. I could give you some very Russian names of individuals who attended the conference, but on the US side of things, some big names there included James Hansen, the longtime NASA climate scientist, astronomer Carl Sagan, Paul Ehrlich, the author of the controversial book, The Population Bomb. There were heads of nonprofit organizations, even business and fossil fuel industry executives. Finally, there was Senator John Hines of Pennsylvania and Congresswoman Pauline Schneider, moderate Republicans that wanted to tackle climate change in Congress. My current book project is actually spotlighting the conservation work of 6 specific moderate Republicans, including John Hines. But the end result of this conference was the attendees writing and signing a letter to both President George Herbert Walker Bush and Russian leader Gorbachev, the letter proposing that the two countries work together to tackle climate change and offering specific ways to do so. In closing, I have briefly touched upon two aspects of Stewart Udall's legacy within the realm of environmental diplomacy. We looked at his international work within the realm of 1960s conservation, specifically with parks, dams, and recreation, and we looked at his attendance of in the 1989 greenhouse glasnost with Robert Redford. I look forward to watching and listening in on the remainder of this commemorative event, and if you would like to follow up with me, on that last slide there, please. Feel free to email me. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Scott, for your observations and insights. Our second keynote speaker this afternoon is a distinguished juror, the Honorable Diane J. Humetewa. Judge Humetewa, who's an enrolled member of the Hopi tribe, is a U.S. District Judge for the U.S. District Court of Arizona, as well as a former U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona. In past years, she also served as a Udall Foundation trustee. Judge Humetewa, please.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be a part of this celebration. And I do also want to thank the Udall board and certainly Senator Udall, as well as my fellow speakers and all of the behind the scenes staff that are working to make this possible. You know, Stewart Udall's legacy is really hard to define because it spans so wide and so deep. We know much about his work as a conservationist and a steward of the land, but I had to search to find out about his work with Indians and on Indian issues. And I think the reason for that, as I came to discover, is because when you examine his history, it was evident to me that he really took a back seat to the voices of Indians and tribes in developing federal Indian policy. It was obvious that he understood that these policies, after all, would affect us as Indian people and as tribes. His understanding of Indians and their lives developed, of course, from his family's deep roots in Arizona and in the Southwest. Those early years, his formative years, and also in working around and being with Indian people, led to a deep understanding and respect for their life ways and the land that they lived on and with. And if I could have the first slide, please. We've heard about his book, The Quiet Crisis. And in the chapter on land wisdom, I pulled out a couple of the quotes that really resonated with me about his understanding of Indian ways of thinking in terms of their lives and the earth. And one of the quotes that really struck out to me was an initial quote in that chapter, where he says, "The most common trait of all primitive peoples is a reverence for the life-giving earth. And the Native Americans shared this elemental ethic. The land was alive to his loving touch, and he, its son, was brother to all creatures." In that chapter, he goes on to explain a number of very historical figures and their discussions when they went to Washington, D.C. to talk about preservation of their tribal hunting areas and so on. And he goes on later to describe, again, the belief that tribal people had with regard to the land. And he says here, the land and the Indians were bound together by the ties of kinship and nature rather than by an understanding of property ownership. And with that conception, the Indians' emotional attachment for his woods, valleys, and prairies were the very essence of life. And it was this idea, his understanding of the views of Indians that land was not property to be owned by an individual, that he then later goes on to describe as how these differing views on land and land use would lead to the inevitable clash between Indians and non-Indians. So as the Secretary of the Interior, his work to protect and preserve the land, I think, went hand in hand with his work on Indian issues. And if I could have the next slide. In one of his first statements as Interior Secretary, in a press release, he put forth a vision of federal Indian policy to end termination and relocation efforts that failed so many Indians. And he described this new trail for Indians. And that vision included equal citizenship, maximum self-sufficiency, full participation in American life, an emphasis on Indian development rather than on termination. Indians are to look after their own affairs, development their own Indian-owned resources. And he was really big on expanding vocational and educational opportunities for Indian youth. And one of the important principles was to ensure that there was this consensus model of developing a communication network between the tribes, the federal governments, and the state governments, and taking a look at reorganizing the BIA to expand its efforts with the other federal agencies for the benefit of Indians. But before he made that great pronouncement, about 6 or so, 7 months into his administration, as he did in the Congress, he sought the consensus input of Indians and tribes in shaping their own destinies. In the summer of 1961, over 5,000 Indians convened for about 7 days to develop a consensus. The preamble to that consensus is on the next slide, but that document that they developed over that time was about 50 plus pages. And the document set forth these principles in detail that, again, abandoned the termination policy of the last administration was critical. Adopting a policy of broad educational process to remove the obstacles which prevented Indians from making full use of their own resources. And understanding that Indians had a desire to participate in developing their own programs with guidance as needed and requested. And it included things like permitting Indian preference in hiring at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And it also outlined the vision that there should be these credit programs, land purchase funds to permit tribes to buy back land in heirship and allotments. Really forward-thinking principles, I think, when you reflect on it back in the time. In addition to that, one of the first acts as secretary that he committed to was he created a task force, again, building consensus. This task force was to study the problems of Indian administration within the federal government and to make recommendations for the benefit of both the Indians and the nation. And this task force was made up of congressional members, state leaders, people within the Interior Department, members of the National Congress of American Indians, and the public at large. The task force held nationwide about 15 days worth of hearings. They gathered all kinds of information about people's belief about what should happen with this Indian question and the federal government. And I think here you can always see throughout his work this model of consensus building in order to find the common grounds, to remove the tension between Indians and non-Indians that seems to always be present. The task force report is really fascinating because it's over 90 pages of detailed information. Some of that information was controversial, but in the conclusion pages, and I just lift a couple of sentences from that task force report, are some of the, I think, ideas that Secretary Udall, pounced upon and thought would make sense for his administration. The task force report says in some of the concluding paragraphs, the task force believes that in the foreseeable future, the proper role of the federal government is to help Indians find their way along a new trail, one which leads to equal citizenship, maximum self-sufficiency, and full participation in American life. It goes on to say, finally, since many of the problems relating to Indian development are local problems, it must use its influence to persuade local governments, as well as those who live near Indian reservations, to recognize that their stake in the Indian future and to work with the Indians and with the federal government is preparing the new trail. And of course, I think we see in his work as secretary that he continued to work through these goals. Can I have the next slide, Molly? About 3 years later, he also described his implementation of the task force goals. In his speech to the National Congress of American Indians, he reminded everyone that although President Kennedy was gone, his work on behalf of Indians and tribes continued. That is, with a goal towards economic self-sufficiency, full participation in American life. Goals that, quote, recognize that Indians can never be fully realized regardless of statutory rules unless the Indian people are in a social and economic position to wish to participate, to merge the wisdom and special qualities of their cultural heritage with that offered them by the rest of American society. And so I think in his delivering his remarks to the NCAI, he basically says that more than any people in this country, the Indian people, I believe, have an understanding of what President Johnson meant when he referred to the Great Society. In his address to the NCAI, he ushered in the new President Johnson's administration and really spoke to them about not just President Johnson's Great Society and War on Poverty and how the tribes could fit into that initiative, but he also wanted to make sure that they understood that the legacy that started to build under President Kennedy would continue, and in fact would continue to flourish under this new administration. He does go on in great detail about how tribal governments could participate in the war on poverty and benefit from some of the understandings or the programs that were being developed throughout the administration. And I think President Johnson's administration has been recognized as expanding the federal administration's Indian programs beyond the Interior Department when you study what his Great Society program and policies were all about. If I could have the next slide, Molly. And so it is obvious to me that Secretary Udall's influence reached the highest levels of our government. I think this is evident even before President Kennedy was elected. I found this really very fascinating, this letter from not yet President Kennedy to Oliver Lafarge. Now, those of you who do not know who Oliver Lafarge was, he was actually the president of the Association of American Indian Affairs. He himself, as I understand it, was not a Native American, but he was an American Indian rights activist. And in fact, I think he lived in the Santa Fe, New Mexico area. And I think that's how he may have gotten to know Secretary Udall. He's also a very well-published individual. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner for a story that he wrote about a Navajo boy who struggles with identity. It's called Laughing Boy. So I found his background very fascinating. But in any event, the letter that was sent to Oliver Lafarge by John F. Kennedy stated his views on federal policies toward American Indians. In that letter, he pledged that the government would discharge its moral obligation to our first Americans. As you can see there, there's a passage from that letter. And he basically says there would be no change in treaty or contractual relationships without the consent of the tribes concerned. No steps would be taken by the federal government to impair the cultural heritage of any group. There would be protection of the Indian land-based, credit assistance, and encouragement of tribal planning for economic development. He goes on to say that if he is elected as president, his Secretary of the Interior will bring leadership into the Bureau of Indian Affairs to implement the policies, promises, and that his secretary's promises will not go ignored or undermined. And of course, his secretary would be Stewart Udall. What is in that letter to Oliver Lafarge by the soon-to-be President Kennedy, when I think about it, although I can't dig up the exact history or document to prove it, I could almost see Stewart Udall prompting Oliver Lafarge to make the inquiry, to get the commitment, to receive the repudiation of termination from John F. Kennedy. And while President Kennedy's term would tragically end, the work on his promises would not. And so under President Johnson, Secretary Udall's influence remained very strong. President Johnson appointed the first tribally enrolled commissioner of Indian Affairs, Robert Bennett, who was in Oneida of Wisconsin. And in his installation ceremony with Secretary Udall present, President Johnson said, "Commissioner Bennett, your president thinks the time has come to put the first Americans first on our agenda. And we are going to give you that job this morning as soon as you are sworn in." Secretary Udall would also install John Crow, who was a Cherokee, as assistant director of the Bureau of Land Management. And in March of 1968, President Johnson delivered a speech to the United States Congress, one of only a handful in the last century. That speech is titled "The Forgotten American." And in that speech, he says, "I propose a new goal for our Indian programs, a goal that ends the old debate about termination of Indian programs and stresses self-determination, a goal that erases old attitudes of paternalism and promotes partnership and self-help." President Johnson went on to establish the National Council on Indian Opportunity by an executive order, and he appointed the vice president as the chairman of that council, and it included secretaries from all over the federal departments. And its goal was to review the programs and to make broad policy recommendations that reflect the needs and desires of the Indian people. I think in these presidential aspirations of the 1960s, including, although with somewhat now controversial background, President Johnson also signed into law the Indian Civil Rights Act. But in these presidential aspirations of this time, I think we can see Secretary Udall behind the scenes work, advancing the voice of American Indians. And I think when you look at some of the statements of these presidents, you can see that much of it echoes Secretary Udall's New Trail speech in 1961. I think Secretary Udall's work cemented the foundation of what would become federal Indian policy even up to today. You know, in reflection, as a former staff counsel to the Committee on Indian Affairs, I had such a narrow historic focus. I thought, well, we're on the cutting edge. And I thought, yes, I'll look back at those documents and those hearings of the 80s. But in reality, this work was going on many, many years prior, thanks to Secretary Udall. Well, I think his work, again, reflects the ongoing federal Indian policy principles of today, which include full participation of tribal governments in their own destinies. And it includes continuing the federal policies of Indian self-determination and self-governance. And I think with respect to these policies, he accomplished what he set out to do. And I could not end without saying a word about Secretary Udall's work to address the impact of uranium mining on tribal members. In 1978, he uncovered the impact of this mining on unwitting Navajo miners who had been vigorously recruited to mine ore or yellowcake in the Four Corners region. I think these men, when you read about some of this uranium mining, these men, you can tell, were proud participants in the national war effort of the 40s. But what many of them did not know until many years later was, in so doing, they and their families were being exposed to radiation, and some would characterize this radiation as stronger than that in Hiroshima. In what should have been his retirement years, Stewart Udall, I read, would show up at community meetings, at chapter houses, or wherever someone would host him on Navajo and offer his legal help. He would go on to represent plaintiffs against the federal government seeking damages for the injuries that were sustained. He developed the legal theories and evidence that uranium exposure resulted in cancer and physical harm to these miners and their families, that its remnants injured the land and the water that it came into contact with. And he eventually did bring suit in Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada, and other courts. While he would eventually lose some of these federal court cases due to government sovereign immunity, his work in the courts and his documentation of cancer from uranium mining on the Navajo absolutely paved the way for legislative action, including what we know now today as the downwind compensation laws. There was an article I read, there was an expose on him in Santa Fe, and you know, in just plain simple terms. He was asked about his work and why he was doing it. And I thought this quote was wonderful. It would be a good thing for the government and a good thing for the country to say, we goofed. We made some big mistakes. We killed some innocent people, and now we're going to make it right. Well, in closing, I thought about meeting the great Stewart Udall. It was on the event of the renaming of the Morris K. and Stewart L. Udall Foundation. In my view, he seemed a man content in his life. And looking back at it, I think we can all see why. He lived for a greater purpose beyond himself. And in finding that purpose, I think he made so many of our lives and this land better. I want to close and thank the Udall Scholars for continuing on this important work and honoring the legacy of Stewart Udall. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these very valuable and incredibly timely reflections, Diane. We're now going to have a very brief 7-minute break during which you can enjoy a slideshow of some images of Stewart Udall from the University of Arizona Special Collections Archives. And this is a good time to mention that veteran PBS producer John DeGraff is currently directing a documentary about the life of Stewart Udall. He's looking to talk to more people who knew Stewart well. If you did, or if you need more information, please contact Molly and she'll put you in touch with John. Thank you. And we'll reconvene in 6 minutes. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're ready to reconvene for the second part of this afternoon's event, a panel discussion exploring further some of the themes that were touched on earlier. The moderator for our panel discussion is my Udall Center colleague, Professor Andrea Gerlach, who's also a professor in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment at the University of Arizona. Andrea, please go ahead.
Thank you, Bob. Our roundtable panel discussion features 3 individuals who will reflect on Stewart Udall's legacy of environmental diplomacy. We're honored to have Carletta Chief join us from the University of Arizona, Jennifer Pitt with National Audubon Society, and Karthikeya Singh with the Netherlands-based SED Fund. Collectively, our 3 roundtable panelists have experience working in both public and private spheres and with and on behalf of vulnerable communities. In the process, they've helped build networks and partnerships promoting environmental diplomacy. Following our discussion, we'll open it up for questions and answers from the audience. So please submit your questions using the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom middle part of the screen. Alternatively, you can reach Molly via email with your question. We're going to begin with introductions. I'd like to ask each roundtable participant to just take a few moments and briefly introduce themselves. May we begin with you, Carletta?
Thank you, Dr. Gerlach. And thank you to the Udall Foundation, the Udall family, and the Udall Center for having me here today. And thank you for joining us. Yeah, Torich evening Schlo, Tohana Bashishin, as a Lane Dashiche, Tachine Dashinale. I am Bitterwater, born for near the water. My maternal grandfather is Midi Goats, and my paternal grandfather is Red Running into the Water. This is how I define myself as a Diné woman. I'm originally from Black Mesa, Arizona, on the Navajo Nation. My family lived within the Peabody leasehold area, and I grew up witnessing the environmental and health impacts of coal mining and living without electricity or running water. I'm an associate professor and extension specialist at the University of Arizona in environmental science. I work with Native American communities on water challenges they face. My most recent projects include the Gold Key Mine Spill, the Net Exposure Project with the Navajo Nation, the Pyramid Lake Paiute Climate Adaptation Project, the Indigenous Food, Energy, Water Security, and Sovereignty Training Program, and the Superfund Research Program, Community Engagement Corps with Indigenous communities. Thank you for having me here and to celebrate the legacy of Stewart L. Udall's environmental diplomacy.
Thank you, Carletta. Jennifer, can we turn it over to you for an introduction?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Gerlach, and thank you to the Udall Center. It is an honor and privilege to participate today. Again, my name is Jennifer Pitt. I work at the National Audubon Society, and for about 20 years, more than 20 years, I have been working as an advocate for the health of the Colorado River and all the beings that depend on the health of that ecosystem. And that has really been a privilege and a delight to spend my working days doing that. Most of the time that I have spent in that geography has been at the US-Mexico border, where I have developed partnerships and really good friendships with environmental NGO colleagues working for Mexican organizations. And we have built cross-border relationships between ourselves that really have enabled the United States and Mexico to come together for a broad collaboration and cooperative set of agreements on the Colorado River that include commitments to begin restoring the Colorado River Delta, which really hasn't had the river flowing through it for most of the last half century. I think in the spirit of today's event, I want to mention something as well that's going on at the moment in my professional life, which is that there has been a recent Politico article talking about a racist culture that is pervasive at Audubon. And I just want to acknowledge that and say we need to fix what's not right. Nobody should live or work in a work culture that doesn't support them. And I hope we do better in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'd like to turn it over to Karthikeya now for an introduction. And thank you for joining us at what I think is a rather late hour for you right now.
Yes, greetings to everybody from The Hague, Netherlands, the city of peace and justice. It's an honor to be here. Let me go ahead and give a shout out to all the Udall Foundation scholars and fellows who might be on the call and who are a lovely community of people that I'm a part of and what has brought me into this family and this culture that we are honoring here today. Rather than really explain what I've been doing, I think I should share the story of becoming a Udall scholar from 2006, when we were actually asked to reflect on an essay from Morris Udall, The Spaceship Earth, Standing Room Only. And I recall that quite vividly because he talks about the various carrying capacities of our ecosystem and the model of development which the US had really led. And I received the fellowship and had a summer internship in India in the summer of 2006. And I came straight from that internship experience to the retreat, which is really the induction process for the scholars. And I remember really reflecting upon what I had just witnessed. It was my first time traveling to India on my own without my parents, going to work at an environmental think tank in New Delhi, where I worked a lot on river pollution and groundwater issues and got to really see the track that India was on. And I remember speaking up, introducing myself at that retreat and saying, there's a whole nother side of this planet which is really trying to emulate the style of development that the US has led the path on. And if we don't figure out a way to share this common ground and think about new pathways of development, there are going to be all kinds of new conflicts and tensions in our society. And I am a third culture individual. I am an immigrant to the United States. So I think since that time, since becoming a scholar, I have really rooted myself and my work in bilateral, essentially science diplomacy style work through everything that I have done. I think that's the kind of thread that you can sort of see. And that's what I continue to do today as I work on furthering the energy transition.
Thank you for the introductions. Well, let's get started. Let's begin with vision and how vision evolves and how vision changes. During Stewart Udall's tenure in the 1960s, big reclamation projects like dams were popular. Our keynote speaker, Scott Einberger, highlighted this earlier in his talk. The Central Arizona Project, or the CAP, right here in Arizona, exemplifies this attitude. I'd like to ask the panelists, how might Secretary Udall have reconciled this sort of approach with his views on wilderness or his views on parks? Did he eventually come to see a different set of views on water infrastructure projects like the CAP? Did his vision evolve? How are these views around infrastructure seen more globally today? Maybe we can begin with you, Jennifer.
Thanks. It's a great question. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to speak with a former reclamation employee who had actually managed the environmental review process for the CAP canal in preparation for its construction. And what he said to me was, we studied every inch of that canal's route and we thought hard about the impacts, but we never once thought to look downstream. We did not realize we were building a project that would bring the Colorado River to its knees. So I want to try to take myself back to the 60s when people were debating this project. I think it's worth pointing out that it was not a big new plug in the Colorado River. It wasn't Echo Park Dam, which was a controversial proposal in the 50s on the Green River. It wasn't Bridge Dam or Marble Canyon Dam, the proposals to bookend the Grand Canyon National Park with dams. It in fact was to be sited on Lake Havasu, which is an impoundment that was created by Parker Dam in 1938. At the same time, Secretary Udall supported development of the CAP. He wrote in an article, "A day on a river can be an incomparable experience," and in fact was championing passage of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. As secretary, he commissioned a nationwide study of rivers and secured the law that's responsible for protecting dozens of rivers from development across the country. In the 60s, I imagine that Secretary Udall was thinking about the difference between dry, dusty St. John's, where he grew up, and the halls of power that he was now occupying in our nation's capital. And he was listening to people dreaming about the development opportunities in Arizona if they could only put more of the Colorado River to use. He was also listening to people who saw that Arizona was already developing on fossil groundwater and thought that a pivot to surface water was actually a sustainable solution. The issue that was under debate, and this is clear in the congressional record, was whether in fact there was enough water to sustain CAP supply from the Colorado River over time. Those folks debating it may not have seen climate change coming back in the 60s, but they did see that the upper basin, the upper Colorado River basin, had rights to the river that once developed would leave insufficient water supply available to the CAP. In as early as 1963, Secretary Udall actually pushed back on some of the CAP proponents, telling Arizona's senior senator, Carl Hayden, that the prospect of shortages on the Colorado River pointed to the need for a regional plan for the river's development, that Arizona couldn't go it alone in advocating for the project. And he said, "I must serve as Secretary of the Interior for the United States, not Secretary of Interior for Arizona." And ultimately, the solution that was adopted, and it was an imperfect solution, was to command reclamation to study how the Colorado River water supply might be augmented with water from another basin, maybe the Columbia or the Mississippi. And about the best thing I can say for the sake of those river ecosystems is that nothing has come of those studies. So on the one hand, Secretary Udall supported building the CAP, a project that did add to the problems accumulating downstream in the Colorado River Delta. And on the other hand, he helped pave the way for considerable economic expansion in Arizona. And his support for the project did not deny the facts of what in fact the river's supply was at the time that they understood. And at the same time, he managed to protect many other rivers with path-breaking federal legislation. And I'll just end by saying, by quoting something that the Wildcat, which is the University of Arizona's newspaper, recorded from Secretary Udall in a 1999 interview, which is that the era of dam building ended too late, but it finally ended.
Thanks, Jennifer, and for referencing probably a young student journalist at the University of Arizona interviewing him. Thank you very much. I'd love to turn it over to you, Carlette, if you have some thoughts about the CAP and this idea of vision and how visions evolve and change over time.
As a man born 1 year after my Navajo grandfather in 1920, and raised on and around Indigenous traditional homelands of the Zuni, Navajo, Apache, Stewart Udall witnessed Native American life from afar as the son of a white settler and a homesteader. Apart from the deep spiritual connection of the Zuni, Apache, and Navajo people, Stewart Udall shared a view of being a steward of the land and depending on the land and water to raise food. I imagine his childhood, much like mine, was often filled with quiet times of reflection and appreciation of the beautiful landscape and observations of the natural environment, her health, and our dependence on Mother Earth. As Honorable District Judge Diane Humetewa spoke in her keynote, Stewart Udall made inaugural steps to consider Native Americans by establishing the 1961 task force to make recommendations for better policies for the benefit of tribes. I think that this fueled his passion for environmental conservation during his tenure as Interior Secretary, but also created turmoil when he was advocating for the Pacific Southwest Water Plan. He was troubled when the Sierra Club executive director, David Bauer, protested and challenged him on his plans to dam the Grand Canyon. His love for the beauty of the natural landscapes eventually resulted in his downscale version of the water plan. Although it prevented damming and flooding parts of the Grand Canyon National Park, it did lead to the eventual operation of the coal-fired National Navajo Generation Station, hence transferring the environmental and health costs to the Navajo and Hopi people. I think he was focused on the economic benefits of jobs and royalties to the Navajo and Hopi people. I'm not sure that he wrestled much with NGS and its impacts to tribes, because at that time there was very little environmental health research, which became more prominent later. On the other hand, tribes in southern Arizona along the Salt and Gila rivers were critical in this legislation and supported it so that they could have access to water, and they helped with the passage of the legislation. This later became critical in one of the largest Indian water settlements of the Gila River Indian community with CAP water allocation. Less than a decade later, I think Stewart Udall probably reconsidered the NGS CAP deal as he spoke about anthropogenic impacts of fossil fuel burning, such as in his prophetic speech that he gave in 1972 at ASU, entitled The World Environment, a Program for the People of Planet Earth. He foresaw future environmental challenges that would face men because of man's view of conquering the world. His obsession with technology, speed, and travel, and rapid population growth. Stewart Udall disowned this belief that the availability of power and energy was endless. I think about 20 years later, maybe Stewart Udall considered these environmental health impacts of extractive mining through his advocacy as a lawyer, working for the compensation for Navajo uranium miners. He worked with his family, including his son, Senator Tom Udall, for decades to compensate uranium miners and downwinders. I imagine that through these extensive interviews that he came to understand mining impacts on Indigenous people. As a Diane woman, and on behalf of my own family, we greatly appreciate all the hard work, countless hours interviewing, fundraising, and his advocacy that Stewart Udall devoted himself for over 30 years, which eventually led to the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act of 1992, which was later improved in 2000.
Carletta, thank you for your remarks. We welcome comments from you now, Karthike.
Yeah, thanks for that. You know, in reflecting on what my colleagues here have just said, I'm trying to think about you know, the place of large-scale infrastructure projects at that time and what they mean today. And this sort of harkens back to what I was saying in trying to convey to my peers in the Scholars Network what I had just witnessed, which was this phenomenal leap forward that India was making, and the types of infrastructure lock-in and the model that was being followed. I think we live in a much different time now, and I think the coronavirus has only brought this to the fore even more. I mean, I think in the 70s, there was already a conversation on small is beautiful and trying to get you know, more decentralized energy solutions, even though we were early on in the sort of technological breakthroughs front. But as we see where energy infrastructure in particular is headed, I think we can only sort of come to the conclusion that experts and policymakers are starting to realize that the type of planning that we had, say in the 60s, 50s, and 70s, and the lock-in of that infrastructure, we need to emerge out of that and create a new development paradigm. And particularly with large-scale infrastructure projects like dams in particular, there's hundreds of dams across the U.S. that have outlived their lifespan, and there's talk of trying to securely bring them down. And I think one of the most fantastic examples of this is the Elwha River Dam in Washington and what that's done to reclaim the ecosystem, to reclaim the salmon run there that a lot of the Indian community really wanted to see. And this is important now more than ever because we also have an understanding and appreciation, a very real appreciation of giving nature its due space. I mean, research is showing that the jump of zoonotic diseases from wilderness to our world is made more possible by massive land use change. So I think we need to rethink development and rethink the design of institutions that do that level of planning at every level. And I think we'll come back full circle to a lot of the models of the Indigenous communities around the world of decentralized and more in tune with local nature. And I think, as we make this transition for a lot of these large-scale infrastructure projects, particularly those on energy, there's a very real conversation that is starting to socialize in the US and in Europe and in some other parts of the world around a just transition. You can't just flip a switch and turn off power plants and mines and not think about the consequences of what this means for those communities. And I can fully appreciate, the work that and the thinking that might have gone towards the need for bigger, faster, bolder to get the most electrons flowing to uplift livelihoods. But I think, we have a much better understanding of upstream and downstream community impacts and ecosystem impacts to really take this moment, this pit, and use it as a real pivot to build in a different way.
Thank you for your remarks. Before we jump to our next question, I just want to pause for a second and ask the panelists if they have any further comments they would like to add, or if they want to respond to anything that they've heard from their fellow panelists.
Yes, I agree with Kartikeya saying about his comments about just transition. And that is such a critical concept for us in Indigenous communities, especially with the closing of the Navajo generating station and the loss of many jobs. This land that's being reclaimed, this is where I come from. What happens now for the people who've lost jobs, who've lost lands? And we have to think more creatively, and that involves transitioning into a more just future that involves sustainability as the forefront, where Indigenous people do not have to bear the cost of energy.
Okay, if there are no further remarks at this time, I think we'll shift to our second question. We've heard today of the powerful role that Secretary Udall played in terms of environmental diplomacy in the American West, but also nationally and internationally. Many challenges remain today. Just here in the American West, we face diminishing supplies of the Colorado River water, environmental threats to protected areas like the Grand Canyon, questions of Indigenous sovereignty over water and natural resources, and growing manifestations of climate change on issues like wildfires. I'd like to ask the panelists, where do you see good examples of environmental diplomacy playing out in the world today? And are there places, issues, or circumstances demanding greater diplomacy? I think we'll start with Carletta.
Yes, thank you, Andrea, Dr. Gerlach. Today we're celebrating the legacy of Stewart Udall and his ability to work across party lines and to negotiate to protect the environment. Something we're sorely missing in this present day. I like the note that Stewart Udall left his colleagues on the last day as Interior Secretary, where he said, "I believe our children and our grandchildren will take pride and satisfaction that men and women of diverse views from all parts of our nation could work together so well to accomplish so much." It reminds me of a statement by a Navajo farmer at a listening session that we held after the Gold Key mine spill of 2015. That farmer said, "We can't be biased or place blame. We all have to work together. It's going to take many generations to fix these issues." I think Indigenous environmental challenges and threats to Indigenous sovereignty is demanding environmental diplomacy. For example, today, just as Kartikeya Singh mentioned, COVID-19, it has amplified food, energy, and water insecurities across the world and disproportionately impacting Indigenous communities. In the United States, COVID-19 is rampant on the Navajo Nation, one of the largest tribes in the United States, where poverty rates are more than twice the state of Arizona. Navajo leaders cite lack of healthy foods and running water as reasons for this prolific transmission, which has resulted in one of the highest COVID-19 infection rates in the United States, third only to New York and New Jersey. I think the Navajo Nation president, Jonathan Nez, is an example of Indigenous environmental diplomacy through advocating for environmental health justice and to address the legacy of mining impacts on Navajo people. And today pushing for the federal government to address the lack of running water to 35% of the Navajo people by pushing back on the distribution of the CARES funding. President Nez has worked with scientists to address the impact of these injustices across the Navajo Nation. And most recently, I've been able to be part of this, where President Nez created the Navajo Nation Water Access Coordination Group that consists of Navajo departments, enterprises, federal and state agencies, nonprofits, and universities, working collectively together to think creatively about how we can provide drinking water to the Navajo people in less than 9 months. I think the science diplomacy is happening with Indigenous climate leaders like Winona LaDuke, Evan Peters, Janine Yazzie, and youth climate actions leaders like Shukul, Martinez, Nayland Pike, and many others. Indigenous people are deeply connected to the environment for their livelihoods, for spiritual and cultural practices. Climate change will also impact them uniquely based on socioeconomic, political, infrastructural, and environmental factors. Unfortunately, we haven't moved far in terms of addressing Indigenous environmental injustices and moving away from helicopter research. There's still a lot of room for Indigenous voices and perspectives to be included in environmental and water policies. There's a need to decolonize science and to have community-driven Indigenous environmental research. There needs to be action to address Indigenous concerns for people, Indigenous people, and for water for the environment. I was recently part of a water conference with the Water Resources Research Center that focused on Indigenous views on water. And there was a great turnout, but it was mostly Indigenous people. Where are the non-Indigenous policymakers? So I think we can do more. And I believe that Stewart Udall saw this clearly when he was advocating for uranium miners through the RECA Act. He saw how there was a bureaucratic legal maze that was not designed to compensate Navajo miners. And he pointed it out. And his diplomacy involved tribal nations and bringing them to the table. I recently also talked to my Stanford classmate, Brenna Clanny, who's Navajo, and who worked with Senator Tom Udall's office while she was pursuing her environmental law degree. And through her, I learned about the deep commitment that Senator Udall have for Indigenous people and lands. And I have hope for Indigenous leaders who can fill these shoes and step up into this environmental diplomacy. I think we must continue to fight for diversity, inclusion, equity, as Senator Udall said, and also belonging. And with working with Indigenous communities and talking about resiliency, it's important that we also understand Indigenous governance, culture, political, and tribal perspectives. It's important to engage Indigenous perspectives so that we can address these challenges. As my own elders say to me, they challenge us to look forward and to make decisions for 7 generations. And I think the Udall legacy has been such that looking forward to 7 generations, and I hope that we will continue to do so. And I challenge you to think forward as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Carletta, for that positive and hopeful message. I just want to remind the audience that the Q&A function is open, and we'll turn to it in about another 10 minutes or so for audience questions. But if any questions come to mind, please do just pop them in there and we'll turn to those quickly. Well, Jennifer, we'd love to hear from you. Where do you see good examples of environmental diplomacy playing out today? And where are there avenues, venues, places, issues where we need to be working a little bit harder?
It's a great question, and I actually want to start just by making a couple comments about some things I've learned about, more things I've learned about Secretary Udall's tenure at the Interior Department. At that time, there was actually a very considerable dispute between Mexico and the United States that emerged around the quality of water that the US was delivering, which actually was not specified in the treaty that was signed back in the 40s, which really didn't specify a water quality standard. And that problem persisted, or that dispute did persist all through the 60s and was not resolved until the early 70s. So it's clear that it's something that called for Secretary Udall's involvement throughout his tenure as secretary. And what I did discover about that is that over and over again, he called for the facts to be brought to the center of the table in the binational discussions. And I will say that I think he grew frustrated with the political nature of the negotiations, which between the two nations over and over again would be influenced by external factors or extenuating circumstances, such as the oil crisis that was growing at that time. So one thing he did propose was a code of international law that would confer explicit jurisdiction on the World Court or an arbitral tribunal to provide appropriate relief in cases involving multinational pollution in both legal proceedings brought by one nation against another. And I think at the heart of that is the real belief that facts and a common understanding of those facts need to inform how we resolve these kinds of disputes. And having worked for many years now with the United States and Mexico on these collaborative agreements managing the Colorado River, I would observe that the key to success there really has been information sharing and a common understanding of how the Colorado River works. And people have asked me at times about the collaborative process on the Colorado River, both binationally and also domestically in the United States. We have really 9 states in 2 countries that are making very complex decisions about sharing one resource that serves 40 million people, a number of important federal protected areas on the river, at least 22 tribes with recognized water rights on the river. It is a complex playing field, and how are we maintaining a collaborative process for the most part through these last 2 decades? And people are asking that in part with interest in what lessons might be learned to bring to how we're going to address climate change and energy transitions. And I guess what I return to is what Secretary Udall was putting front and center, which is you can't have a negotiated solution until you share a common suite of facts and a common understanding of what is at the heart of the matter. And I think we need to invest in that. I'm a little uncertain in the current political climate how to be successful at that endeavor, but I think that's where we need to start.
Thank you, Jennifer. We'd love to turn it over to our third panelist to hear some of your remarks. Karthikeya?
Yeah, well, you know, in case we hadn't, in case you'd forgotten, I don't think we have, thanks to Jennifer's comments just right now, we did just have an election in the US, and I'm forgetting which person to attribute this quote to, but, you know, we may have our differences internally, but it is generally agreed that the politics stops at the border. And, you know, after that, it's not a collection of blue, purple, red states, but it's really the United States. And there's considerable power to do things diplomatically in partnership with other countries to address our shared environmental challenges, to take advantage of emerging technologies, and to share in the furthering of innovation across all kinds of technology sectors. So let me just talk a little bit about some fantastic sort of types of diplomacy that are happening, not just at a bilateral or multilateral level, which many people are familiar with, you know, the Multilateral Framework Convention on Climate Change. But as part of trying to address the global threat of climate, there are a range of actors that have now really stepped out in front, which are provide a good template for how we need to continue to further the efforts of diplomacy at all levels. I mean, it's fantastic to see what Secretary Udall was able to accomplish at that time and how many countries he was able to visit, and the sort of science glasnost that we heard about. But there are a collection of subnational actors that I think are equally powerful and important. In many parts of the world, the sort of federal center-state relations really vest a lot of power in state and local governments and indigenous communities that have sovereign rights over their own resources that need to be leveraged. Some examples that have really been kind of surprising is the coalition of states that form the Under 2 coalition, which have sort of pledged to target their strategies to be in line with emissions not exceeding the 2 degrees centigrade guardrail. There's a new alliance of nations and states that have come together just, I think, in the last year or two that form something called the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is really chaired by the Canadian government and the United Kingdom, but also includes other countries and some states from countries around the world, really thinking through what it means to look at technological solutions, just transition conversations to actually get to a future where, at least in the power sector, we have moved beyond a fossil thermal coal value chain pipeline. There's also a fantastic program that I was actually running in my previous institutional home that was funded by our Energy Resources Bureau of the State Department, called the US-India State and Urban Initiative, which was really a pairing of US and Indian states in a collective journey of energy transition, thinking through how can state officials learn from each other and how they're managing the incredible energy transition that is underway right now. It requires having certain skill sets and being adept in not only navigating the right kinds of policies, but also, you know, not just sort of, you know, traditional sort of scenario demand and supply-based energy policies, but also policies in procurement and other sort of technical expertise that one might not think of that are, I think, really relevant in today's conversation on how we do diplomacy. There was Also a project funded by our own federal government called the Eco Cities Partnership, connecting US and Chinese cities and industries. So there are plenty of really good examples of science-based diplomacy at various levels of governance that I think can provide really positive, that can really meet the moment, if you will, in trying to deliver on where we need to be. And I think there's some really good examples to build on for policymakers to consider as next steps. You know, there's Indigenous communities that are managing their own energy, large-scale generation units that could partner with Indigenous communities in other parts of the world. That's something that sort of actually emerged as a possibility out of one of the projects that I was looking at. There's a possibility to really look at workforce and labor union diplomacy to, again, facilitate a just and equitable energy transition. What does it look like to do those kinds of trainings for nation states that are ahead of the curve and those that are really starting to get moving on the conversation? When it comes to water, I mean, you know, water rights, water access rights are a perennial issue around the world. And I mean, what about a Colorado to Cauvery River water dialogue that really brings together how two countries, the world's oldest and largest democracies, really are dealing with water conflict issues and transboundary conflict issues? I think these are levers that need to be experiences that need to be thought about being leveraged in order to really allow us to do diplomacy better. And then finally, the other really relevant science-based diplomacy that I think we should really double down on, particularly as we emerge out of COVID and think about investments, is really R&D. And I think our Department of Energy has a fantastic suite of programs where we partner with other countries like China, India, Israel, Japan, you name it. There are joint R&D projects in place looking at you know, ways to further the bounds of energy technology innovations, electric vehicle innovations that are going to be necessary if we're really going to get there faster. I mean, innovation doesn't happen in a silo. The transfer of ideas is really required. Just as it was happening with common ground conservation and the idea of American national parks being replicated, it can happen across agencies in partnership, you know, a whole of government approach that really reaches out beyond our borders and partners with the right communities across a range of issues that are plaguing the, you know, the environment.
Thank you for your remarks. This is a perfect note to end on. It sounds like there are plenty of good examples of environmental diplomacy alive and well in the world today, and Secretary Udall would certainly be pleased. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Bob to work us through a little Q&A from the audience. We have about 15 minutes remaining.
Thanks very much, Andrea. I think I'm going to start with not a question, but a comment from an observer, a participant today. And it's Tony Massaro, who is a former dean of the U of A, University of Arizona College of Law. And she says, the last time I met Secretary Udall at his home in Santa Fe was when I was dean of the College of Law. He's a grad and honored in our lobby alongside his brother Morris. Stewart was then deeply involved in issues of global population growth and the pressures it put on sustainability. Always active, always engaged, always seeking a more just world for all, even in a time when many choose to put down their work. A very nice comment, and we thank Tony for making it. Let me turn to the first question, which is by someone who remains anonymous, and here is the question. Climate change and many environmental issues have international origins with local effects. Would Stewart Udall have advocated for international engagement to solve these difficult issues? For example, engaging with China or India to combat climate change. I'd love to hear each of their opinions, meaning the panelists, as representatives from their communities as well. So who would like to take that on?
I can take that on, I suppose.
Okay, go ahead, Kartikeya.
Yeah, I mean, in reading through some of the materials about the legacy of Stewart Udall and the advocating that he was doing for new international institutions to monitor and provide resources, monitor environmental challenges, provide solutions, and back that up with funding to actually execute. I think he was very much open to international engagement to address a complex issue like climate change. I mean, I think the experience of the USSR colleagues coming over to the US was kind of would be a perfect example that it didn't matter if it was a country that one had hostile relations with or it was a friendly ally. I think when we look at global threats and we look at where the emissions are and we situate the sort of development, the moment that the country is in terms of its population's needs and where they are on their development trajectory. I think the possibility, if you want to address a global challenge that's ultimately going to fall in your backyard, there's a need for engagement. And like I said, we saw that in the lead up to the Paris Accord being signed. There was a lot of positive engagement with China. That was actually one of the biggest to have China be more committed to engagement and emission reductions, and also India. And then the shared sort of mission innovation that was a parallel if you will, of getting 20 global large economies to commit to doubling their R&D investments, their public money to advance clean tech innovations in their countries. So I think, I think the evidence for a possibility of Stewart Udall doing deep engagement with large emitting countries was there, and I think he would certainly continue that.
Thank you. Jennifer, you sort of addressed this earlier in talking about US-Mexico relations with regard to the Colorado, so maybe you can pick up on that a little bit more.
I imagine that were he secretary today, Secretary Udall would relish the opportunity to reach out to Mexico. We're at a particular moment actually right now where we've had a lot of transition in who's representing Mexico in the binational dialogue in the last couple of years. And we're entering a period of expecting new people to be representing the United States side of the table. And one of my work assignments recently was to add to Audubon's 100-day transition memo, something that it's sort of a ritual that we go through every time there's a transition in the White House. And what I added there was really what we need is a reinvestment in the relationships across the border. So I think, I can see from the history that he was involved and that these international issues caught his attention, and that he understood that solving the issues locally also involved the sovereigns, but that you couldn't simply solve issues at arm's length. You had to pay attention to the facts on the ground and the needs of the communities on the ground. But I think where we need to start right now at this moment with the United States and Mexico is for the people to reinvest in the relationships. You can't have one thing I have learned as a practical matter is that negotiations are very difficult if you don't have a personal relationship, if you don't have the opportunity literally to break bread. COVID is making this difficult. But from the stories I've heard and from the reading I've done, I imagine he would relish the opportunity.
Thank you, Jennifer. Carletta, obviously Indian country is not exactly international, but some of the same conditions, transjurisdictional and very discrete differences across the border, could be applicable to Indian country. So what do you think of Stewart's answer to that question in regard to Indian country?
Indigenous people are around the world globally. There's 300 million Indigenous people who hold 80% of the biodiversity. And if Stewart Udall was alive today, I think he would be involved in those conversations, especially because he was so active late in his life, interviewing Diane, uranium miners, and having this deep conversation about the impacts of uranium mining on their lives and their livelihood. And being that climate change is, one of the most pressing challenges today for Indigenous people, I think he would have gotten engaged in those conversations globally. And with his advocacy, negotiating skills, I think that, he would have been at the forefront of talking about climate change and its unique impacts on Indigenous peoples. With Al Gore and Robert Redford's films on climate change, maybe he would have gone on with that and looking, at advocacy in film with relation to Indigenous people. So I think, there was, I definitely think there's a lot to be talked about in terms of climate change and its burden on Indigenous peoples who really rely heavily on their land and live in sustainable ways.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carletta. Another anonymous attendee has just posted a question, which I'm going to read. Learning about Stewart Udall's life, work, and legacy leaves me with a sense of regret that we seem to lack this type of leader today. Those with vision, boundless energy in the service of the public, passion to advocate for impacted communities, willingness to learn from mistakes, and interest and ability to build consensus across boundary. I wonder if the panelists see any leaders like this emerging within their communities today, and what can be done to foster such leadership. That's quite a handful there. Would anybody like to tackle that?
I'll try and answer. I think that when we talk about the successes of a person like Secretary Udall, we are able to view it from decades now in the future to see the sort of net result of his impact. We were not in the room listening to, well, how the sausage got made, how he made his progress. And I would reflect that now, having worked with several administrations at Interior on progress with Mexico and the Colorado River, particularly with respect to a collaborative process to begin restoration of the Colorado River Delta ecosystem, that there are times when even the strongest advocates for that work to move forward from the US federal government frame what they're talking about in words that do not feel comfortable to me or familiar to me, or even make them sound like they are advocates for that work. But they're listening to the context, paying attention to the constituencies on all sides of them, and trying to navigate that as best possible. So I would say, for one thing, we need to maybe assess the success of some of our leaders by what they accomplish over time, not necessarily everything we hear them say along the way. And I would say that the work that I saw Mike Connor do, both as Commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation and also as the Deputy Secretary of Interior under the Obama administration, was phenomenal. And he did not come to the table insisting that ecosystem restoration be a part of those agreements from the get-go. But when, I would say that he shepherded us there carefully in a way that many state leaders and water users with great power to throw up roadblocks brought them along in a way that they could live with it and ultimately could celebrate. So I do see that leadership, and I have to be hopeful because it's hard to work for an environmental organization if you're not hopeful.
Yes, and maybe we should end on that hopeful note, optimistically, that there are other Stewart Udalls and Mo Udalls and other advocates out there, and they're being trained, and some of them are young and vigorous and have all of the qualities that our questioner listed. So I think with that, we'll end it, and we'll thank all of the panelists for their participation and responses, and thank everyone who's been listening in, who held out until this last minute, and hope you've enjoyed the program as we have in bringing it to you. So thank you. Goodbye.